I am Camille, 35 years old, and at my own father's funeral, my family divided his estate before his casket was even lowered into the ground. My uncle sneered and handed me $100 bill telling me to call a rideshare because I was getting nothing. I let them finish their pathetic performance. Then I stood up, looked them dead in the eye, and said 4 exact words that made my mother's crystal wine glass shatter against the marble floor. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace and your empire. The heavy, humid air of Atlanta clung to the towering windows of our family estate in Buckhead. The funeral repast for my father, Jeremiah Sterling, was in full swing, turning the house I grew up in into a bustling stage for the city's black elite. Caterers in crisp black uniforms wove through the grand foyer, balancing silver trays of elevated Southern cuisine. Everywhere I looked, I saw the prominent figures of my father's world. Deacons from our megachurch stood in tailored suits, speaking in hushed, somber tones. Women adorned with the signature colors and pins of legacy sororities offered polite, practiced condolences. Local politicians, men and women my father had supported through decades of generous campaign donations, shook hands and networked under the guise of paying their respects. It was exactly the kind of high society spectacle my mother Vivian thrived on. I stood near the curve of the grand mahogany staircase, completely invisible, in a room filled with people who had known me since I was a child. My father had built Sterling Logistics from a single beat-up delivery truck into a massive regional empire that dominated the Southeast supply chain. He worked grueling 80-hour weeks, his hands perpetually calloused, even after he moved into the executive suite. I was the one who inherited his mind for numbers, his relentless drive, and his refusal to accept defeat. But in this house, those traits were considered liabilities in a daughter. My mother. Vivian stepped into the center of the foyer, tapping a silver spoon against her crystal wine glass. The sharp, clear ringing instantly silenced the low murmur of the crowd. She was dressed in flawless morning couture, a black silk dress that cost more than most of her employees made in a month, her posture rigidly perfect. She began her speech with the practiced cadence of a seasoned First Lady of the Church, her voice quivering just enough to convey grief while remaining entirely in control of her audience. "I want to thank you all for gathering here to honor my beloved Jeremiah," she announced, placing a delicate hand over her heart. He was a titan of this community, a man who built a legacy out of sheer will and faith. But a legacy cannot sustain itself. It requires strong, dedicated hands to carry it forward. She turned her gaze deliberately away from the staircase where I stood. Instead, she extended her arm toward the center of the room, directing the attention of 200 guests to my older sister Dominique and her husband Preston. Dominique offered a tragically beautiful smile, dabbing at her dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. Preston stood beside her, his arm wrapped protectively around her waist. He was a white hedge fund manager who carried himself with the unearned, staggering arrogance of a man who believed he was the smartest person in any room he entered. In these dark days, Vivian continued, her voice swelling with theatrical emotion. Jeremiah found his greatest comfort in knowing that Sterling Logistics would remain in the hands of the truly loyal. Dominique and Preston have been the very pillars of this family. They stayed here in Atlanta. They rolled up their sleeves and learned this business. They are the true heirs to the Sterling legacy, the ones who never ran away when the family needed them most. The insult was precise, calculated, and designed to draw blood. The entire room knew exactly who the runaway was. 10 years ago, after graduating at the top of my class with a degree in finance, I had asked my father for a management position at Sterling Logistics. My mother had intervened immediately, insisting that the gritty world of supply chains was no place for a woman of our social standing, and that I should focus on marrying well, just like Dominique had done. When my father silently deferred to her judgment to keep the peace, I packed my bags and moved to New York. I built my own private equity firm from absolute scratch fighting tooth and nail in a male-dominated industry until I controlled a portfolio worth hundreds of millions. But to my mother, my independent success was a profound embarrassment because it was something she could not control or take credit for. Polite applause rippled through the foyer. Guests murmured their approval of Dominique and Preston, casting covert, pitying glances in my direction. I kept my face entirely impassive, refusing to give Vivian the satisfaction of seeing my reaction. Before the applause could fade, a heavy hand clamped down on my bicep. I turned to find my Uncle Tyrone, my father's younger brother, towering over me. The sharp scent of expensive bourbon and cheap cologne rolled off him in waves. Tyrone had always harbored deep resentment toward my father's success, treating the company payroll like his personal checking account, while contributing absolutely nothing of value to the daily operations. "Time for family business, Camille." Tyrone sneered, his grip tightening painfully as he physically pulled me away from the staircase and toward the private dining room at the back of the house. "The adults need to have a conversation." I yanked my arm free but followed him down the long hallway, my heels sinking into the thick Persian runners. Tyrone pushed open the heavy oak doors of the private dining room and ushered me inside. The contrast from the noisy, crowded foyer was jarring. The room was soundproof, dark, and suffocatingly tense. Vivian, Dominique, and Preston were already waiting, seated around the long, antique dining table, like a tribunal preparing to pass judgment. Tyrone locked the doors behind us with a loud, definitive click. He walked to the head of the table, taking the seat that had belonged to my father just days ago. He reached inside his suit jacket and pulled out a single sheet of printed paper, sliding it across the polished mahogany surface until it stopped directly in front of me. "We wanted to handle this quietly before the lawyers get involved and complicate things," Tyrone said, leaning back with a smug, self-satisfied grin. "Your father and I had a long talk before he passed. He knew his health was failing, and he wanted to make sure the company was protected from outside interference." I looked down at the paper. It was a poorly drafted document lacking any official legal seal, notary stamp, or witness signatures. It was typed in a generic font, claiming to be an addendum to my father's last will and testament. The text explicitly revoked any previous claims I might have had on the family estate and transferred 100% of the controlling shares of Sterling Logistics directly to Dominique and Preston, with a permanent advisory stipend guaranteed for Tyrone and Vivian. "It is completely binding," Vivian added smoothly, crossing her legs and resting her hands on her lap. "Your father realized in his final days that blood loyalty means more than whatever fancy financial games you play up north. He wanted the business run by people who actually understand sacrifice. Dominique and Preston are taking over as co-chief executive officers effective immediately." I stared at the document, letting the sheer absurdity of their actions wash over me. They had not even waited for the dirt to settle on his grave. They had actively conspired to forge a legal document banking on the assumption that my grief would make me compliant and unquestioning. They honestly believed I was still the discarded 22-year-old girl they had driven out of the city 10 years ago. Preston let out a short, condescending laugh. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a silver money clip. He peeled off a crisp $100 bill and tossed it across the table. It fluttered in the air for a second, before landing right on top of the forged signature. "For your ride to the airport," Camille Preston said, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table. "You have been a runaway for a decade playing pretend in the finance world, while we carried the actual weight of this family. The adults are handling the real business now. You are out of the will. You are out of the company. You get absolutely nothing. Do yourself a favor, take the cash, go back to New York, and let us manage the empire." The silence in the room was absolute. They watched me eagerly, waiting for the tears, the screaming, the desperate begging for my rightful share of the inheritance. They wanted the emotional breakdown that would validate their narrative of me being the unstable, jealous sister who could not handle the family's success. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I calmly picked up the $100 bill from the table. I smoothed out the corners with meticulous precision, folded it perfectly in half, and walked slowly around the mahogany table toward Preston. He watched me approach, a confused smirk freezing on his pale face. When I reached him, I leaned down, slipped the folded bill directly into the breast pocket of his bespoke suit, and patted his chest twice. Then I stood to my full height, shifted my gaze to meet Tyrone's bloodshot eyes, and delivered the reality they were entirely unprepared for. I own the company. The 4 words hung in the air, heavy and lethal. For a second, nobody moved. Then Vivian's crystal wine glass slipped from her fingers. It hit the marble floor, shattering into dozens of jagged pieces, the dark red liquid pooling around her expensive shoes, like fresh blood. Preston's arrogant smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer panicked confusion. "What the hell are you talking about?" Preston snapped. Standing up so abruptly, his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "You do not own anything. You have not been involved with Sterling Logistics in 10 years. This document proves everything goes to my wife and me. You are delusional if you think you can walk in here and stake a claim." I turned my back on Preston, refusing to engage with his outburst. I walked back to my side of the table, opened my designer briefcase, and pulled out a thick, red-stamped manila folder. I threw it down exactly where their forged document had been resting. The heavy thud of the files hitting the wood made Dominique jump in her seat. "You should really check the corporate accounts before you try to forge a hostile takeover," I said, my voice dangerously even. 6 months ago, my father came to my office in New York. He flew up in secret because he was terrified you would find out. He brought me the internal ledger. The real one, not the fabricated quarterly reports you and Tyrone have been feeding the board. Tyrone's face drained of all color. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. Vivian looked frantically between her brother-in-law and her golden son-in-law, the first cracks of genuine terror showing through her heavily powdered face. My father discovered that for the past 3 years, the 2 men he trusted most had been quietly embezzling millions from the operational accounts. I continued pacing slowly behind my chair. "You funneled the cash into shell companies to cover Preston's catastrophic stock market losses and Tyrone's gambling debts. You leveraged the entire logistics fleet, the warehouses, the very legacy my father bled for, putting the company $70 million in the red. Sterling Logistics was drowning in toxic debt, and the bank was preparing to seize everything." "That is a lie," Dominique shrieked, slamming her hands on the table. "Preston is a financial genius. He multiplied the company's valuation. He told us he secured our future." "Preston lied to you, Dominique," I said coldly, finally looking at my sister, "just like he lied to the auditors. But he could not lie to me. When my father brought me the books, I saw exactly what they had done. So I did what I do best. My private equity firm quietly initiated a massive debt buyout. I used my own capital to purchase 100% of Sterling Logistics' secured debt directly from your primary lenders." Preston let out a harsh, desperate laugh, though his hands were trembling visibly. "You cannot just buy corporate debt without board approval. My firm Vanguard Capital is the primary underwriter for the entire Sterling portfolio. We hold the senior liens. You cannot touch this company without going through my executive committee. I will bury you in litigation by Monday morning. You will be bankrupt before the courthouse even opens." I stopped pacing and stared directly into Preston's panicked eyes. I let a slow, terrifying smile spread across my face as I picked up my phone and tapped the screen to illuminate it. "Check your email, Preston," I commanded, my voice dropping to a whisper that echoed perfectly in the silent room. "I didn't just buy my father's debt. I bought Vanguard's controlling interest last night during an emergency shareholder meeting. I am the majority owner of your firm now. I am your boss. And as of 3 minutes ago, you are officially fired for gross financial misconduct, fraud, and embezzlement." Preston scrambled for his phone, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped it. He swiped open his screen. I watched the exact moment his entire world collapsed. The color completely abandoned his face as he stared at the automated corporate message wiping his administrative access in real time. Dominique let out a high-pitched wail, grabbing Preston's arm and shaking it. "Tell her she is lying. Preston, do something. Tell her you still control the money. Tell my mother to fix this." Vivian sprang from her chair, Her face twisted in pure, unadulterated rage. She lunged across the table, her hand raised to strike my face. I caught her wrist mid-air, my grip tight and unyielding. She struggled against my hold, her chest heaving as she spat venom at me. "You wicked, ungrateful child!" Vivian hissed, her perfect facade entirely shattered. "You come into my home on the day we bury your father and try to steal what belongs to us. I am the matriarch of this family. I will ruin you. I will tell the entire congregation, the entire city, exactly what kind of monster you are. You will have nothing." I released her wrist, pushing her hand away with a look of utter disgust. "You have already ruined yourselves, mother. I just brought the receipts." Tyrone stepped around the table, putting himself directly in my personal space. He was a large man accustomed to using his physical size to intimidate people into submission. He leaned down, his face inches from mine, his breath hot and foul. "You think a fancy piece of paper stops me?" Tyrone whispered dangerously. "I built the streets this company runs on. Try stepping foot in that headquarters on Monday morning, little girl. You will not even make it from the parking lot to the elevator." I held my ground, not backing away a single inch. "I am not a little girl anymore, Tyrone, and I highly suggest you pack your bags. Monday morning is going to be a bloodbath." Monday morning arrived with a torrential downpour that washed the streets of Atlanta clean, but the real storm was waiting inside the towering glass and steel headquarters of Sterling Logistics. I sat in the back of a blacked-out Suburban, watching the rain hammer against the tinted windows. Beside me sat Marcus, my lead forensic accountant, his eyes locked on the glowing screen of his tablet. In the front passenger seat was Deputy U.S. Marshal Vance, a man whose quiet demeanor masked a lethal efficiency. We were parked directly across the street from the empire my father built, and I was about to take it back by force. Inside the building, the atmosphere was sheer panic. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive suite on the 12th floor, I could see the erratic movement of shadows. Tyrone had been in the building since Sunday night. He had locked down the entire facility, deactivated the employee keycards, and hired a team of armed private security contractors to barricade the lobby. He was currently tearing through the executive offices, dragging boxes of financial records toward heavy-duty industrial shredders. He was a desperate man, backed into a corner, trying to destroy a paper trail that I already held in my hand. "Ready when you are," Ms. Sterling Marshal Vance said, turning his head slightly. "The warrant is signed, the federal injunction is active, and local law enforcement has secured the perimeter. Let us go collect my property," I replied, my voice steady and cold. I stepped out of the SUV into the driving rain, my black trench coat shielding my tailored suit. Marcus and Vance flanked me as we walked purposefully toward the grand entrance of Sterling Logistics. 3 additional black SUVs pulled up behind us, unloading a dozen more federal agents and my team of auditors. The private security guards standing behind the glass doors saw us approaching. They were large, intimidating men, but they were mercenaries paid by the hour. When Marshal Vance held up his federal badge and slapped the court order against the glass, the head guard took one look at the heavily armed agents behind me and immediately unlocked the doors. They stepped aside without saying a single word. I walked into the massive marble lobby of my father's company. The air was thick with tension. A few early arriving employees were huddled near the reception desk, whispering and pointing. I did not stop to explain. I bypassed the security turnstiles and marched directly to the private executive elevator. I swiped my master override card, a digital key Marcus had cloned and authenticated the night before, and the doors slid open smoothly. The ride to the 12th floor was silent. The numbers above the doors climbed steadily, ticking off the seconds until Tyrone's reign came to a violent end. When the elevator doors parted, the smell of burning paper and overheated electric motors hit me instantly. The shredders had been running non-stop for hours. I stepped onto the executive floor, the heels of my boots sinking into the plush carpeting. 2 more private guards stood outside the boardroom doors. Vance and his deputies moved forward swiftly, disarming the guards and securing the corridor. I walked past them and pushed open the heavy oak doors of the boardroom. Tyrone was standing at the head of the long conference table, his suit jacket discarded, his tie loosened, and sweat pouring down his face. He was staring frantically at a laptop screen, his thick fingers hammering against the keyboard. The room was a disaster zone. Manila folders were strewn across the floor, Filing cabinets were hanging open and empty coffee cups littered the expensive wood table. He looked up as I entered, his bloodshot eyes widening in shock before twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He slammed his hand down on the enter key with a triumphant, breathless laugh. "You are too late, little girl," Tyrone sneered, his chest heaving as he pointed a shaking finger at the laptop screen. "You think you are so smart with your Wall Street tricks. I just liquidated the main operational accounts. $5 million is gone, wired straight to a secure offshore account in the Caymans. It is untraceable. You can have the empty shell of this company. I am taking what is mine." I did not flinch. I slowly walked toward the table, keeping my eyes locked on his. I gestured for Marcus to step forward. Marcus did not say a word. He simply plugged a small encrypted flash drive into the boardroom's master console and tapped a few keys on his tablet. Instantly, the large presentation screens on the wall flickered to life, mirroring the display on Tyrone's laptop. The screen showed the banking portal, the $5 million sum, and a bright red dialog box flashing in the center of the display. Transfer failed. Routing numbers frozen by primary creditor. Tyrone stared at the massive screen, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He tapped the enter key again and again, his frustration turning into sheer panic. "What did you do?" Tyrone yelled, slamming his fists against the keyboard. The money was cleared. I saw the confirmation screen. "You saw a ghost system, Tyrone," I said, coming to a stop at the opposite end of the table. "I locked the primary routing architecture at midnight. Every keystroke you made this morning was routed through a secure sandbox environment my firm set up. You have not moved a single dime. You have just provided my forensic team with a documented step-by-step confession of attempted wire fraud." Tyrone let out a primal roar of anger. He kicked the heavy leather chair out of his way and charged around the table, his massive frame barreling toward me. He raised his fist, intent on destroying the person who had just dismantled his entire life. Marshal Vance intercepted him before he could take 3 steps. Vance drove his shoulder into Tyrone's chest, using the larger man's momentum against him, and slammed him face first into the polished wood of the boardroom table. 2 other federal deputies rushed in, pinning Tyrone's arms behind his back and forcing him down. "Get off me!" Tyrone screamed, struggling against the agents. "This is my company. I built this place with my brother. You cannot do this to me, Camille. I am your blood. You stopped being blood the moment you let my father die," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying calm. Tyrone stopped struggling. He froze against the table, his eyes darting toward me with a sudden sharp fear that had nothing to do with the federal agents holding him down. "What are you talking about?" Tyrone stammered, his voice cracking. He had a heart attack. It was his blood pressure. The doctor said there was nothing anyone could do. I pulled my phone from my pocket. My hands were perfectly steady, but the rage burning inside my chest was hot enough to melt steel. I walked over to the audio-visual control panel and plugged my phone into the auxiliary cord. "My father did not just give me the ledgers 6 months ago," I explained, looking down at Tyrone's terrified face. "He knew you and Preston were rats. He knew you were cornered. And my father was a man who always planned for the worst-case scenario. He set up a dead man's switch, a cloud recording app on his phone that activated whenever his heart monitor detected a severe spike in his vitals." I tapped the screen, selecting the final audio file my father ever created. The file was timestamped last Tuesday, the night he passed away. The speakers in the boardroom crackled to life. First, there was the sound of heavy, labored breathing. My father's voice came through, weak and strained, gasping for air. Then the sound of a door opening. "Jeremiah, you do not look so good." Tyrone's voice echoed through the speakers loud and clear. "My pills," my father gasped on the recording. "Top drawer. Tyrone, please. I cannot breathe." Then Preston's voice joined the recording, sharp and nervous. "The auditors are coming on Thursday, Tyrone. If he recovers, he is going to sign those takeover papers with Camille. He already told Vanguard he was pulling the accounts. He is going to send us to federal prison." There was an agonizing silence on the recording, filled only with the sound of my father struggling to draw breath. "Just leave the pills in the bathroom," Tyrone's voice said, cold and detached. "He is having a massive attack. Let nature take its course. We need him out of the way before Thursday. "Do not touch the phone. Walk away, Preston." The recording ended with the sound of the door clicking shut, leaving my father alone in his final moments. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. The federal marshals holding Tyrone looked at him with profound, undisguised disgust. Marcus stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the floor. I looked at the man who had let my father suffocate to save his own skin. Tyrone was weeping now, ugly guttural sobs tearing through his chest. He could not look at me. He kept his face pressed against the mahogany table. "Tyrone Sterling." Marshal Vance said, his voice hard and professional. "You are under arrest for embezzlement, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and felony manslaughter. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you start using it." The deputies hauled Tyrone to his feet, the metallic click of the handcuffs echoing sharply in the large room. They began marching him toward the door, his head hanging in total defeat. I stood in the center of the room, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of my father's death finally begin to lift. I had done it. I had executed the trap flawlessly. The rot was being excised from the company. But just as the deputies pulled Tyrone into the hallway, the private elevator chimed. The doors slid open, and the chaos outside erupted violently. Vivian stormed onto the executive floor, completely ignoring the federal agents. She was flanked by Pastor Jenkins and 3 of the most prominent wealthy elders from our megachurch. They marched down the corridor like a holy army walking into battle. Vivian's eyes locked onto Tyrone in handcuffs, and then she turned her furious gaze toward the boardroom where I stood. She pushed past the marshals, stepping into the room with her finger pointed directly at my face. Her voice shook with a righteous, blinding fury. "You devil!" Vivian screamed, the sound tearing through the quiet office. "You stole your father's legacy, you stole my future, and now you are sending your own blood to prison. You are a curse on this family, Camille. I will bring the wrath of God and the power of this entire city down on your head." The church elders stood behind her, their faces set in grim, judgmental masks, ready to wage a social war I was fully prepared to win. I did not flinch at the threat. The echo of Preston shouting that he would have me bankrupt before the courthouse even opened hung in the stifling air of the private dining room. He stood there, chest puffed out, chin raised, fully believing he still held the high ground. He thought he was the ultimate apex predator in a room full of prey. He thought his Wall Street pedigree made him untouchable. I looked at him with nothing but pure, unadulterated pity. I let the silence stretch, allowing his arrogant words to ring hollow against the mahogany walls. Then I slowly reached into the pocket of my tailored trousers and pulled out my phone. I unlocked the screen with a deliberate, unhurried swipe. "You really should have read the terms of Vanguard Capital's latest liquidity phase, Preston," I said, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. The kind of quiet that commands absolute attention. Preston scoffed, adjusting his expensive silk tie. He tried to maintain his alpha male facade in front of my mother and sister, but I could see a tiny muscle twitching in his jaw. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. "Vanguard is a multi-billion-dollar firm. We do not have liquidity issues, and we certainly do not report to boutique private equity firms run out of a glorified broom closet in New York." I tapped my screen 3 times. "I did not buy your debt, Preston. I bought you." The room grew so still I could hear the rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Vanguard Capital has been dangerously over-leveraged for the past 18 months, I explained, walking slowly around the edge of the heavy dining table. "You made terrible bets on commercial real estate and tried to cover the margins by issuing high-yield corporate bonds. You thought you were being incredibly clever, keeping it off the public ledger. But my firm specializes in finding bleeding companies and bleeding them dry. For the last 4 weeks, I have been quietly purchasing every single bond Vanguard issued through a series of anonymous shell companies." Preston's face began to lose its color. His confident posture wilted fractionally as his financial mind raced to catch up with the trap I had just snapped shut around his neck. "Last night at 11:30, I initiated a debt-to-equity swap on those bonds." I continued, my voice sharp and relentless. "Vanguard's board of directors held an emergency closed-door session. They were terrified of a total collapse. I offered them a lifeline. I traded the debt for a 51% controlling interest in Vanguard Capital's holding company. The paperwork was finalized at 2 in the morning. That is impossible, Preston whispered. The bravado was entirely gone from his voice, replaced by a hollow, breathless panic. The board would have notified me. I am a senior partner. You were a senior partner, I corrected him. As the new majority owner, my very first executive action was to restructure the leadership team. I demanded a full forensic audit of your specific portfolio. Do you want to know what my team found, Preston? They found the offshore accounts. They found the money you siphoned from Sterling Logistics and laundered through Vanguard's client accounts to cover your personal gambling debts. I am your boss, I stated coldly, stopping directly across the table from him. And as of exactly 3 minutes ago, you are officially terminated for gross financial misconduct, embezzlement, and violating your fiduciary duty. Check your email, Preston. Preston frantically dug into his suit jacket and ripped his phone from his pocket. His hands were shaking so violently, he almost dropped the device on the marble floor. He swiped at the screen, his eyes wide and panicked, as they darted back and forth across the glowing glass. I watched the exact moment his entire world imploded. The screen illuminated his face with a pale, sickly light as a cascade of automated security alerts flooded his device. I knew exactly what he was seeing because I had drafted the deployment protocols myself. Microsoft Exchange disconnected. Administrative credentials revoked. Biometric access denied. Corporate credit accounts instantly frozen. No, 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 Preston muttered, stabbing his finger against the screen over and over again, as if hitting the glass hard enough would magically reverse the total destruction of his career. This cannot be happening. Let me in. Let me in. Your company car has already been reported stolen if you attempt to drive it off the lot, I informed him, crossing my arms. Security is currently boxing up your desk on Wall Street. You are completely locked out of the industry, Preston. By tomorrow morning, the Securities and Exchange Commission will receive a comprehensive dossier detailing every single federal law you broke while playing with my father's money. You are not just fired, you are going to federal prison. Dominique finally grasped the absolute gravity of the situation. Her husband was not just out of the family business. He was stripped of his own power, his income, and his status. The penthouse, the imported cars, the luxury vacations, all of it was funded by stolen money that I had just cut off at the source. Preston Dominique shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the walls. She grabbed his arm, her carefully manicured nails digging into his suit jacket. Tell her she is lying. Tell me you still control the accounts. Fix this right now. Preston could not even look at her. He stared at his dead phone, his mouth hanging open, entirely paralyzed by the swiftness of his execution. Dominique spun around, her face twisted in a mask of pure entitlement and terror. She looked at our mother, expecting Vivian to magically wave her hand and restore their stolen kingdom. Mom, do something! Dominique screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. She cannot do this. She is stealing everything from us. Make her stop. Vivian's pride simply could not process the humiliation unfolding in her private dining room. Her golden child was sobbing. Her chosen son-in-law had been reduced to a trembling, impotent shell of a man. And the daughter she had deemed worthless, the daughter she had actively tried to write out of history, was standing triumphant over the absolute wreckage of their lives. Vivian's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Her eyes burned with a venomous hatred that stripped away every ounce of her refined high society polish. She was no longer the grieving widow or the dignified church matriarch. She was a narcissist who had just lost complete control of her victims. You wicked, ungrateful little wretch, Vivian hissed, her voice dropping into a terrifying guttural register. She lunged forward, closing the distance between us with startling speed. She raised her hand high, the heavy diamond rings on her fingers flashing under the chandelier light, fully intending to slap me across the face, just as she had done countless times during my childhood, whenever I dared to speak out of turn. But I was not a terrified child anymore. I anticipated the strike before her arm even began its downward arc. My hand shot up with lightning speed. I caught her wrist mid-swing, my fingers clamping down around her arm like a vice of solid steel. The impact sent a shockwave up my arm, but I did not yield a single inch. Vivian gasped in shock. Her eyes went wide as she stared at my hand locked around her wrist. She tried to yank her arm back, but my grip was ironclad. The heavy gold bracelets on her wrist dug into her skin as she struggled, completely unprepared for physical resistance. "You do not get to hit me anymore, Mother," I said, my voice dangerously low and vibrating with absolute authority. "You do not get to dictate my worth. You do not get to control my life. You backed the wrong horse. You placed your bets on a pair of incompetent thieves, and now you have to live with the absolute destruction of your own choices." I shoved her hand back toward her chest with enough force to make her stumble backward. She caught herself on the edge of the mahogany table, her chest heaving, as she stared at me with a mixture of profound hatred and genuine fear. She had finally realized that the power dynamic had permanently shifted. I held the keys to the kingdom, and I was going to lock her out. But Tyrone was a different kind of animal. He did not care about corporate takeovers, SEC filings, or frozen bank accounts. My uncle operated on street rules, brute force, and sheer intimidation. He had spent his entire life bullying his way out of consequences, relying on his massive physical size to force people into submission. Seeing Vivian stumble ignited a violent spark in him. He pushed away from his chair and bridged the gap between us in 2 long, heavy strides. He stepped directly into my personal space, towering over me, his broad shoulders blocking out the light from the chandelier. The sharp, sour scent of bourbon and stale sweat radiated off him. He leaned down until his face was mere inches from mine. His eyes were bloodshot and filled with a dark, desperate menace. "You think a fancy piece of paper stops me?" Tyrone whispered, his voice a gravelly, dangerous rumble that scraped against the silence of the room. "You think you can walk in here with your Wall Street tricks and take what belongs to me? I built the streets this company runs on. I control the drivers, I control the warehouses, and I control the docks." He tilted his head, his jaw muscles clenching as he delivered his final warning. "Try stepping foot in that headquarters on Monday morning, little girl. Bring your briefcases and your spreadsheets. It will not matter. I have boys on the payroll who know exactly how to handle a corporate trespasser. You won't even make it from the parking lot to the elevator." In the front passenger seat was Deputy United States Marshal Vance, a man whose quiet demeanor masked a lethal, uncompromising efficiency. We were parked directly across the street from the empire my father built, and I was about to take it back by absolute force. Inside the building, the atmosphere was sheer panic. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive suite on the 12th floor, I could see the erratic movement of shadows and the frantic flashing of overhead lights. Tyrone had been in the building since Sunday night. True to his desperate threat, he had locked down the entire facility, deactivated the standard employee keycards, and hired a team of armed private security contractors to barricade the lobby. He was currently tearing through the executive offices, dragging boxes of physical financial records toward heavy-duty industrial shredders. He was a desperate man backed into a corner, trying to destroy a paper trail that I already held in my hand. "Ready when you are, Ms. Sterling Marshall," Vance said, turning his head slightly to look at me. "The warrant is signed, the federal injunction is active, and local law enforcement has completely secured the perimeter. We have authorization to use whatever force is necessary to breach the building and secure the assets. Let us go collect my property," I replied, my voice steady and cold. And I stepped out of the SUV into the driving rain, my black trench coat shielding my tailored charcoal suit. Marcus and Vance flanked me as we walked purposefully toward the grand entrance of Sterling Logistics. 3 additional black SUVs pulled up behind us, unloading a dozen more federal agents and my elite team of auditors. We moved as a single, unstoppable unit. The private security guards standing behind the thick glass doors saw us approaching. They were large, intimidating men wearing tactical vests, but they were mercenaries paid by the hour. They operated on intimidation, not federal authority. When Marshal Vance reached the doors, he did not politely ask for entry. He held up his federal badge and slapped the heavy court order flat against the wet glass. "Open the doors right now, or we will breach them, and you will all be arrested for obstructing a federal raid," Vance commanded, his voice carrying easily through the thick glass. The head guard looked at the court order, then took one long look at the heavily armed agents forming a tactical wedge behind me. He knew his hourly wage was not worth a federal prison sentence. He reached out and immediately unlocked the doors, stepping aside and lowering his hands without saying a single word. His men quickly followed suit, backing away from the entrance and staring at the floor. I walked into the massive marble lobby of my father's company. The air was thick with tension and the smell of wet rain. A few early arriving employees were huddled near the reception desk, whispering and pointing with wide, terrified eyes. I looked up and saw the massive oil portrait of my father hanging above the reception desk. His kind, sharp eyes seemed to watch me as I crossed the floor. I did not stop to explain myself to the staff. I bypassed the main security turnstiles and marched directly to the private executive elevator. I pulled a master override card from my pocket, a digital key Marcus had cloned and authenticated the night before, and swiped it over the scanner. The doors slid open smoothly. The ride to the 12th floor was completely silent. The digital numbers above the doors climbed steadily, ticking off the seconds until Tyrone's reign came to a violent, humiliating end. When the elevator doors parted, the smell of burning plastic, overheated electric motors, and raw ozone hit me instantly. The industrial shredders had been running non-stop for hours, choking on the sheer volume of fabricated invoices and fake vendor contracts Tyrone was trying to destroy. The air was actually hazy with paper dust. I stepped onto the executive floor, the heels of my boots sinking into the plush carpeting. 2 more private guards stood outside the heavy glass doors of the main boardroom. Vance and his deputies moved forward swiftly, drawing their weapons and ordering the guards against the wall. The mercenaries dropped their hands to their sides and surrendered immediately, letting the marshals disarm them and secure the corridor. The double doors leading into the boardroom were magnetically locked from the inside. Vance gave me a quick nod, stepped back, and kicked the center of the heavy glass doors with a massive strike from his tactical boot. The locking mechanism groaned under the force, and with a second punishing kick, the metal frame gave way. The doors shattered inward, sending a shower of safety glass raining across the expensive hardwood floor. I stepped over the broken glass and walked into the room. Tyrone was standing at the head of the long mahogany conference table. His suit jacket was discarded on the floor. His tie was ripped open and sweat poured down his face in thick, panicked sheets. The room was an absolute disaster zone. Manila folders were strewn across the carpet. Filing cabinets were hanging open with their locks smashed, and a massive hard drive from the server room sat crushed in the corner. He was staring frantically at a laptop screen, his thick, trembling fingers hammering against the keyboard. He was trying to execute the final stage of his exit strategy. He looked up as the glass shattered, and I walked into the room, his bloodshot eyes widening in shock before twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He looked like a trapped animal realizing the cage had just snapped shut. His eyes darted from the federal marshals securing the room back to the glowing screen of his laptop. He slammed his hand down on the enter key with a triumphant, breathless laugh. He hit the button with so much force the keyboard cracked. He leaned heavily against the mahogany table, gasping for air, as a sick, victorious smile spread across his sweating face. He turned to look at me, his chest heaving with exertion and malicious pride. Tyrone laughed, wiping his sweaty hands on his ruined dress shirt. "Too late, little girl. The money is gone and the drives are dust." Tyrone laughed, the sound harsh and jagged, echoing off the mahogany walls of the boardroom. He wiped his sweaty hands on his ruined, custom-tailored dress shirt, smearing a mixture of grease and paper dust across the expensive fabric. He leaned his heavy frame against the edge of the conference table chest, heaving, fully believing he had just outsmarted a team of federal agents and Wall Street sharks. He gestured broadly to the smoking industrial shredders in the corner of the room, then pointed a thick finger at the glowing screen of his laptop. "You are too late, little girl," Tyrone sneered, his lips curling into a triumphant, malicious grin. "The money is gone and the drives are dust. You can have the walls and the desks, Camille, but the liquid assets are currently sitting in an untraceable account in the Caymans. I beat you. Now get out of my building before I have security throw you out onto the street." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice, nor did I show a single ounce of the panic he was so desperately hoping to see. I stood amid the shattered safety glass of the boardroom doors, completely unbothered by his theatrical display. I looked at Tyrone with the cold, detached curiosity of a scientist observing a dying insect. I gave a slight nod to Marcus. My lead forensic accountant stepped forward without a word. He ignored Tyrone entirely, walking right past the sweating, gloating man to reach the master server access panel embedded in the wall behind the presentation podium. Marcus pulled a sleek, heavily encrypted flash drive from the inner pocket of his suit and slotted it directly into the port. He tapped a sequence of commands into his handheld tablet. "What are you doing?" Tyrone demanded, his smile faltering as he pushed off the table. "I told you the local servers are wiped. You cannot recover a wire transfer once it hits the international routing node. You are wasting your time." Marcus did not answer. Instead, the massive 80-inch presentation screens covering the back wall of the boardroom suddenly flickered to life. The display bypassed Tyrone's laptop, entirely interfacing directly with the banking architecture my firm had installed the night before. The screens illuminated the dim room with a stark, blinding white light. Displayed in the center of the massive screen was the banking portal, showing Tyrone's $5 million wire transfer. The digits glowed brightly alongside the offshore account routing numbers he had painstakingly typed out. Tyrone pointed at it, trying to reclaim his bravado. "Right there," Tyrone barked. "It says processing. The money is gone. Watch the screen, Tyrone," I commanded, my voice slicing through the thick air. As if on cue, the status bar on the massive display shifted. The processing icon vanished. In its place, a harsh, solid red warning box overrode the entire screen. The bold text flashed rhythmically, casting a crimson glow across Tyrone's horrified face. "Transfer failed. Routing numbers frozen. Primary creditor override." Tyrone staggered backward, his mouth falling open. He stared at the giant red letters, his eyes wide and uncomprehending. He spun around, frantically hammering the enter key on his own cracked laptop keyboard, desperate to force the transaction through. He hit the keys over and over, his breathing growing shallow and panicked. "What did you do?" Tyrone yelled, slamming his fists down on the table so hard the wood shuddered. "What did you do to my account?" "I froze the corporate routing numbers at exactly midnight," I stated, stepping further into the room, my heels crunching over the broken glass. "Every transaction you attempted this morning was automatically diverted into a secure, closed-loop sandbox environment controlled entirely by my firm. You did not move a single dime to the Caymans, Tyrone. All you did was sit in this room and create a perfectly documented, irrefutable paper trail of attempted grand larceny and wire fraud." Tyrone's face drained of all color. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The shredders, the private security, the barricaded doors, it was all completely useless. He had locked himself inside a cage and handed me the key. He backed away from the laptop, his hands shaking violently. "Listen to me, Camille," Tyrone stammered, holding his hands up in a placating gesture, his voice suddenly stripped of all its venom. "That money was just severance. It was emergency operational funds. We have vendors to pay. You are misunderstanding the situation. We can sit down and talk about this like family." I stopped pacing and stared at him. The sheer audacity of his cowardice was nauseating. "Wire fraud is the least of your concerns right now," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm. I reached into the pocket of my trench coat and pulled out my smartphone. I walked over to the audio-visual control panel on the table and plugged my phone into the auxiliary jack. The interface connected immediately, routing my audio directly into the boardroom's high-fidelity surround sound speakers. "My father was a meticulous man," I explained, looking directly into Tyrone's bloodshot eyes. "He knew something was terribly wrong with the company. He knew you and Preston were cornering him, siphoning his life's work to cover your own pathetic failures. He knew he was surrounded by rats, but what he did not realize until his absolute final moments was just how far you were willing to go to save your own skin." Tyrone swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly in the quiet room. "What are you talking about? My father's phone had an emergency medical protocol." I continued, my grip tightening on the edge of the table. a failsafe designed to activate the microphone and sync to his private cloud server whenever his smartwatch detected a catastrophic drop in his vitals. He wanted a record in case he collapsed while driving or working alone. I saw the exact moment Tyrone's soul left his body. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to grip the back of a leather chair to keep from collapsing onto the floor. I tapped the screen of my phone, selecting a recovered voicemail file. The speakers above us crackled to life, filling the boardroom with a sound that would haunt me for the rest of my days. It was the sound of my father, Jeremiah Sterling, fighting for his life. His breathing was heavy-labored and wet. He was gasping, pulling desperately for air that his failing heart could not pump. Then Tyrone's voice echoed through the speakers, loud and clear, but stripped of any warmth or panic. "Just breathe, Jeremiah," the recorded Tyrone said. "Just stay seated." My father's voice answered, weak and laced with agony. "My pills, in the top drawer. Tyrone, please. I cannot breathe." "Get the pills." There was an agonizing stretch of silence on the recording, filled only with the sound of my father's desperate rattling gasps. Then a second voice chimed in. It was Preston. His tone was frantic, cowardly, and entirely calculated. "If we give the pills to him, he recovers," Preston's recorded voice said rapidly. "If he recovers, the audit happens on Thursday. He already knows about the missing funds, Tyrone. He will send us both to federal prison. We have to let it happen. We cannot call an ambulance yet." Another stretch of agonizing silence. I watched Tyrone standing in the boardroom, his hands covering his face, unable to look at me or the federal agents surrounding him. "Move away from the desk," Preston Tyrone's voice commanded on the audio file, cold and utterly detached. "Let nature take its course. It is just a sudden heart attack. A tragedy. No one will question it. Walk out the door." The recording ended with the heavy, definitive thud of the executive office door clicking shut, leaving my father alone on the floor to slowly suffocate to death while the men he trusted walked away to steal his empire. The silence that followed the recording was absolute. It was a suffocating, heavy void that pressed down on every single person in the room. The federal marshal's men and women, accustomed to dealing with the worst elements of society, visibly tensed. Their hands moved uniformly toward the utility belts at their waists. Marshal Vance stared at Tyrone with a look of profound, unmasked disgust. "You did not just steal his company," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper, yet carrying the weight of a judge's gavel. "You murdered him." Tyrone shook his head frantically, tears of absolute panic spilling over his cheeks. He stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. "That is doctored," he shrieked, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "You fabricated that audio. You are using artificial intelligence. You are framing me. I loved my brother. I loved him." Marshal Vance stepped forward. He did not offer the standard polite reading of rights usually reserved for white-collar criminals. He moved with swift, aggressive authority. Tyrone Sterling Vance bellowed, his voice booming through the shattered doorway. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, felony manslaughter, and federal wire fraud." Two marshals lunged forward, grabbing Tyrone by his upper arms and twisting them violently behind his back. Tyrone let out a yelp of pain as they slammed his chest down against the polished mahogany table, pinning him flat. The heavy metallic ratcheting of handcuffs clicking shut echoed sharply across the room, a sound of absolute finality. I watched him thrash weakly against the table, a broken, pathetic man, finally facing the consequences of his own boundless greed. I felt no pity. I felt no sorrow. I only felt the cold, hard satisfaction of delivering exactly what he deserved. But before the marshals could pull Tyrone to his feet and drag him out of the room, the elevators down the corridor chimed loudly. Heavy, hurried footsteps stomped down the carpeted hallway, followed by the loud crunching of expensive leather shoes stepping over the shattered safety glass of the boardroom doors. Vivian stormed into the room. She was not alone. Behind my mother marched a formidable phalanx of elite church elders. They were powerful, wealthy men in tailored suits, deacons and board members who held massive social, financial, and political sway across the city of Atlanta. They were the very shield Vivian used to protect her flawless public image, brought here to intimidate me into backing down. Vivian's face was a mask of righteous biblical fury. Her eyes swept the room, taking in the shredded documents, the federal agents, and finally Tyrone pinned to the table in handcuffs. Her gaze snapped directly to me, her eyes burning with a venomous theatrical rage. She stepped over the broken glass, raised her arm, and pointed a trembling manicured finger straight at my chest. "This devil is trying to steal her dead father's legacy!" Vivian screamed, her voice reaching a fever pitch that reverberated off the glass walls. "She is fabricating evidence. She is framing her own blood to line her pockets. I will not let you destroy this family, Camille. I will bring the wrath of God and this entire city down on you." Vivian's threat echoed off the mahogany walls of the shattered boardroom, but it landed with the hollow, desperate thud of a woman who had just realized her checkbook was empty. I did not engage with her screaming. I simply offered a polite nod to Marshal Vance, who hauled a sobbing, handcuffed Tyrone out of the executive suite. Vivian watched her brother-in-law being dragged toward the freight elevator, her chest heaving with exertion. Finding no audience for her manufactured outrage, she gathered her stunned church elders, grabbed Dominique by the arm, and retreated. But I knew my mother better than anyone. Stripped of her financial power, physically locked out of the company, and facing the absolute destruction of her high society facade, she would inevitably pivot to the only arena she still controlled. She was going to wage a war of social and religious capital. Sunday morning in Atlanta brought a suffocating heavy heat, but the air inside the cavernous sanctuary of Greater Zion Cathedral was comfortably chilled. This was not merely a church, it was an institution. A sprawling 5,000-seat arena where the city's black elite gathered every week to see and be seen. Politicians seeking endorsements, judges up for re-election, business moguls and wealthy socialites all sat in their designated velvet-lined pews. My father's money had built the new fellowship hall, funded the youth center, and kept the church's massive broadcast ministry on the air for a decade. Because of that money, Vivian treated the sanctuary like her personal throne room. I arrived intentionally late and slipped into the very last row of the upper balcony, cloaked in a tailored navy blue dress. I sat in the shadows, wanting a clear, unobstructed view of the stage. The service proceeded with its usual high production value. A massive 200-person choir swaying in perfect synchronization, blinding theatrical stage lights sweeping across the crowd, and an atmosphere charged with heavily orchestrated emotion. As the music faded to a soft, reverent hum, Pastor Jenkins stepped up to the clear acrylic podium. Jenkins was a highly charismatic man, whose spiritual guidance was heavily influenced by the size of the tithes his congregants provided. He had grown very wealthy off my father's hard work. He gripped the edges of the podium and announced in a somber, vibrating tone that it was time for special testimonies. Right on cue, Vivian stood from her prominent seat in the front row. She was dressed in immaculate, understated white, the absolute picture of pious, dignified mourning. Dominique walked beside her, keeping her head bowed and dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue. The congregation murmured in immediate respectful sympathy as Vivian took the microphone from the pastor. Her hand trembled just enough to convey deep sorrow without sacrificing her perfect posture. She began her performance with the practiced, lethal grace of a seasoned actress, stepping into her defining role. She spoke of her profound heartbreak, the sudden, devastating loss of my father, a titan of the community who had loved his church and his family above all else. She paused, letting the silence stretch, allowing the audience to hang on her every breath. Then the pivot occurred. She raised her head, her eyes flashing under the stage lights, and tears perfectly spilled over her lashes. "But the enemy does not rest!" Vivian cried out, her voice echoing through the cathedral's massive line-array sound system. "While my heart is broken, a thief has entered my home in the dead of night. A prodigal daughter, blinded by worldly greed and northern arrogance, has returned not to mourn her father, but to steal a grieving widow's only source of income." A collective gasp rippled through the thousands of people seated in the sanctuary. Heads swiveled, whispers tearing through the pews like wildfire. Everyone in that room knew exactly who Vivian was talking about. Vivian began to pace the stage, her voice rising in a crescendo of weaponized agony. She detailed how I had swooped down from New York with ruthless lawyers and fabricated documents. She spun a masterfully deceptive tale of how I had forged signatures to lock my own mother and sister out of the family legacy they had sacrificed everything to build. She did not stop there. She brought up Tyrone. She wailed about how her beloved brother-in-law, a man who she claimed had dedicated his entire life to keeping Sterling Logistics afloat, had been brutally dragged out of his office in handcuffs by federal agents. "She has imprisoned her own blood!" Vivian screamed, pointing a trembling finger toward the vaulted ceiling, tears streaming down her carefully powdered face. She has launched a campaign of vicious, fabricated lies to send an innocent man to a federal cell. She wants to leave her mother destitute and her sister ruined. She has traded her eternal soul for a corporate balance sheet. I stand before you today, not just as a widow, but as a mother mourning the spiritual death of her own child. The congregation erupted into a frenzy of shocked murmurs and righteous, misplaced anger. People were shaking their heads, their faces twisted in judgment. The mob mentality had been successfully ignited. Pastor Jenkins stepped forward, placing a comforting pastoral hand on Vivian's shoulder. He took the microphone, his face set in a grave, authoritative mask. He needed Vivian back in control of Sterling Logistics because he needed the corporate donations to keep his own lavish lifestyle afloat. He was fully prepared to use the weight of his spiritual authority to break me. "We are a family in this church." Pastor Jenkins intoned, his voice booming with deep theatrical resonance. "And when the devil attacks one of our own, we stand together and cast out the darkness. Vivian and Jeremiah have been the very pillars of this community. We will not sit idly by and allow a wayward, greedy child to destroy what God has built." Jenkins looked up from the stage. His eyes bypassed the main floor and scanned the massive crowd until they landed precisely on the back row of the upper balcony where I sat. He knew exactly where I was. Vivian had likely placed spotters at the doors to confirm my arrival. "Camille Sterling." Pastor Jenkins called out, his voice a heavy, judgmental thunder that silenced the entire arena. "I know you are in this sanctuary today. You cannot hide from the eyes of the Lord, and you cannot hide from the eyes of this community. We are calling you out of the shadows." The church organist began playing a slow, dramatic minor chord, adding a layer of suffocating tension to the moment. "I command you to step forward!" Jenkins shouted, gripping the pulpit with both hands. "Come down to this altar right now. Repent for the sins of malice, theft, and greed you have committed against your own mother. Drop this wicked legal assault and restore this estate to its rightful owners. Do not leave this building with the stain of betrayal on your soul. Come down here and make it right, Camille, or face the absolute wrath of God and the righteous, unforgiving judgment of this entire city." 5,000 pairs of eyes turned in unison, looking up toward the back balcony. The silence that fell over the colossal room was entirely deafening, broken only by the low, vibrating hum of the organ. The pressure in the room was immense, a psychological vice designed to break anyone who dared defy the collective will of the congregation. They expected me to crumble under the weight of their combined stare. They expected me to run out of the exit doors in tears, ashamed and defeated by my mother's masterful public execution. Or worse, they expected me to walk down that long, humiliating aisle, weeping and begging for forgiveness, handing back the keys to the empire just to escape the social exile. I stood up. I smoothed the minor wrinkles from my navy blue skirt with absolute unhurried precision. I looked down at the stage, meeting my mother's tear-stained, triumphant eyes across the vast expanse of the sanctuary. She thought she had won. She thought this public ambush was her ultimate trump card. She had completely forgotten that I do not play games I am not thoroughly prepared to finish. I did not break eye contact with her. I did not shed a single tear. I did not walk down the aisle toward the altar. Instead, I turned my back to the stage and walked directly toward the glass-enclosed audio-visual control booth located at the very back of the sanctuary. I walked up the carpeted incline of the central aisle, moving with deliberate, unhurried precision. Pastor Jenkins' voice continued to boom through the state-of-the-art sound system, his demands for my repentance vibrating against my ribs. The congregation watched me, their faces twisted in unified judgment, fully expecting me to make a tearful exit through the main lobby doors. They were entirely wrong. I bypassed the exit completely and approached the glass-enclosed audio-visual control booth. The young technician sitting behind the massive mixing board looked up, his eyes wide with confusion. I did not ask for permission. I opened the door, stepped inside, and grabbed the young man by the shoulder of his polo shirt, guiding him firmly out into the corridor. Before he could utter a single word of protest, I pulled the heavy door shut and slid the industrial steel deadbolt into place. He banged his fist against the reinforced glass, but the sound was completely muffled. I was locked inside the nerve center of Greater Zion Cathedral. I pulled my encrypted tablet from my designer bag. The church utilized a standard top-tier Crestron control system for their Sunday broadcasts, a network my forensic IT team had easily bypassed and mapped during the opening worship songs. I located the master input port, took a deep breath, and plugged my tablet directly into the mainframe. Pastor Jenkins was still sweating under the theatrical lighting gripping the acrylic podium. "Do not turn your back on God, Camille," he shouted, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Do not walk away from your family's forgiveness." I tapped the master override command on my tablet. I did not walk away. I took over the service. The massive 50-foot LED screens suspended behind the 200-person choir suddenly went pitch black. The backing track from the organist abruptly cut off. A wave of nervous murmurs rippled through the 5,000 congregants as the sanctuary was plunged into an eerie, expectant silence. Then, with a stark, blinding flash of white light, the screens roared back to life. I did not display the Sterling Logistics corporate bank statements. That was federal evidence, a matter for the courts. For this specific audience, I needed something much more personal, something that would tear Vivian's social standing out by the roots. I projected a series of highly classified, meticulously highlighted financial documents directly onto the screens for every single person in the room to read. The text was massive and undeniable. The header on the documents glowed brightly in the dim sanctuary. Greater Zion Cathedral Orphanage Building Fund. Next to the church's official letterhead, I displayed the offshore banking routing numbers I had extracted while dismantling Tyrone's Cayman Island accounts. The dates and times aligned with absolute devastating perfection. $2 million systematically drained over a period of 14 months in sequential authorized wire transfers. The authorizing signature on every single document belonged to Vivian Sterling, the fund's highly esteemed, deeply beloved chairperson. Vivian turned around, looking up at the glowing screens. The color instantly drained from her powdered face. She dropped her microphone, the heavy thump echoing through the silent room as she raised her hands to her mouth in absolute terror. I tapped another button on my tablet, splitting the massive screens into two distinct sections. On the left side, the undeniable proof of the stolen church donations. On the right side, the receipts for how that stolen money was spent. A high-definition photograph of Dominique posing in front of a custom matte black Mercedes G-Wagon flashed onto the screen. Below the photo was the dealership invoice, proving the vehicle was purchased fully in cash exactly 48 hours after a $300,000 withdrawal from the orphanage account. I swiped the screen again. The next document displayed Preston's staggering gambling markers from a high-stakes underground casino in Macau. The debts had been completely settled using routing numbers directly tied to the church's charitable donations. Every lavish vacation, every designer handbag, every ounce of their manufactured high society lifestyle had been paid for with money meant for desperate, vulnerable children. I reached forward and engaged the microphone on the master mixing board. My voice bypassed Pastor Jenkins, entirely booming through the cathedral's surround sound speakers with icy, unapologetic clarity. "You wanted the truth, Pastor Jenkins," I announced, the sound vibrating through the floorboards. "There is your truth. The orphanage you have been raising money to build all year is entirely bankrupt. My mother did not just steal from my father's legacy. She stole directly from your pockets. She stole from orphans to buy her daughter a luxury SUV and to pay off her son-in-law's gambling debts. The shift in the atmosphere was instantaneous and absolutely violent. The polite, respectful pity the congregation had held for the grieving widow evaporated in a fraction of a second, replaced by raw, unadulterated fury. These were hard-working people who had sacrificed their own income skipping meals and delaying bills to fund that orphanage. They realized they had been conned by the very woman crying tears of victimhood on their stage. People jumped to their feet. Shouts of betrayal and anger erupted from the pews, echoing like a physical wave crashing against the altar. A woman in the third row threw a heavy-bound hymnal directly at Vivian, narrowly missing her perfect hair. Men were shouting, demanding their money back. The mob mentality that Vivian had tried to weaponize against me had rapidly turned entirely against her. Pastor Jenkins looked up at the screens, his eyes bulging in sheer terror. He knew his own lavish lifestyle was funded by the donations of the people currently turning into an angry mob. If he defended Vivian for another second, they would tear him apart, and his ministry would collapse. Survival instinct took over. He grabbed his spare microphone, his face sweating profusely. "Security!" Jenkins roared, his voice cracking with panic as he pointed a trembling finger at my mother. "Remove these women from my sanctuary immediately. Get them out of this church right now." Vivian's flawless, commanding presence shattered into a million pieces. Her elite church friends, the very elders who had flanked her moments ago, backed away in absolute disgust, leaving her entirely isolated on the stage. She reached out, trying to grab the arm of a deacon she had known for 20 years, but he slapped her hand away and turned his back to her. Her social standing, the crown she had worn with such vicious pride, disintegrated in real time. She was no longer a respected matriarch. She was a pariah. Dominique could not handle the crushing weight of public shame. Stripped of her unearned wealth, exposed as a parasite living off stolen charity, the golden child broke completely. She let out a feral, ear-piercing shriek, shoving past the disgusted church elders and sprinting up the center aisle toward the main lobby doors. Vivian collapsed into the front pew, sobbing for real this time, as the congregation shouted demands for her arrest, but I did not stay to watch my mother cry. My work inside the sanctuary was finished. I disconnected my tablet, unlocked the heavy deadbolt of the AV booth, and followed my sister's frantic path out of the sanctuary. I pushed through the heavy oak doors into the sweltering, oppressive Atlanta heat of the massive church parking lot. Dominique was standing near her ill-gotten matte black G-Wagon, her breathing ragged and heavy. She turned around the moment she heard my heels clicking against the pavement. Her face was twisted into a mask of psychotic, unhinged rage, her perfect makeup smeared with sweat and tears of complete humiliation. She had lost everything, and she blamed me for pulling back the curtain. She reached deep into her oversized designer bag. She did not pull out her car keys. She pulled out a heavy, solid brass cross she had just ripped off the lobby display table on her frantic way out of the building. With a guttural, furious scream, Dominique raised the heavy metal weapon high above her head and charged wildly across the asphalt, aiming directly at my skull. The heavy brass cross caught the harsh midday sun gleaming like a jagged weapon as Dominique hurled herself toward me. Her face was contorted into an unrecognizable mask of pure primal hatred. 35 years of pampered entitlement had finally cracked, leaving behind nothing but a feral, desperate woman, terrified of losing her stolen crown. She swung the heavy metal object with every ounce of strength she possessed, aiming a lethal arc directly at the side of my head. I did not flinch. I did not scream. I simply shifted my weight to my left heel and stepped smoothly out of her path. Dominique was entirely blinded by her own rage. She had put her entire body weight into the swing, anticipating the sickening impact of the brass against my skull. When she hit nothing but empty air, her own unchecked momentum carried her violently forward. Unable to stop herself, she slammed face first into the side of Vivian's pristine pearl-white Mercedes Maybach. The impact was loud and sickening. The heavy brass cross struck the passenger side window, spiderwebbing the tinted glass in a massive fracture. Dominique crumpled against the polished door panel, her shoulder colliding with the side mirror, before she slid down the sleek metal frame and landed hard on the scorching black asphalt. The heavy brass cross clattered to the ground, rolling uselessly under the front tire. From the church lobby doors, a collective gasp echoed across the parking lot. The congregation, still reeling from the devastating revelations inside the sanctuary, had spilled out onto the steps to witness the fallout. My private security detail, two massive former military contractors who had been waiting by my SUV, instantly broke into a sprint toward us. Marshal Vance, who had just finished securing Tyrone in a federal transport vehicle across the lot, drew his weapon and began shouting commands. I raised a single steady hand, my palm facing the approaching men. "Stand down!" I commanded, my voice slicing through the heavy, humid air with absolute authority. "Do not touch her. Let her stay exactly where she is." Vance hesitated, his hand hovering near his holster, but he signaled for the security team to hold their perimeter. They formed a wide circle around us, keeping the growing crowd of shocked churchgoers at a distance, leaving Dominique and me entirely alone in the center of the asphalt arena. The sky above us had darkened considerably in the last 10 minutes. The oppressive, sweltering Atlanta heat was finally breaking, giving way to the dark, bruised clouds of an impending summer thunderstorm. A low rumble of thunder vibrated through the pavement beneath my feet. I walked slowly toward my sister. My heels clicked rhythmically against the asphalt, a steady, deliberate countdown to her absolute destruction. Dominique was gasping for air, clutching her bruised shoulder as she leaned heavily against the tire of our mother's luxury vehicle. Her custom silk dress was smeared with grease and parking lot dirt. Her flawless, expensive weave was tangled and plastered to her sweaty forehead. She looked up at me, her chest heaving, her eyes darting frantically as she searched for a way out. There was none. For 35 years, I began, my voice cold and lethal, projecting clearly across the quiet parking lot. For 35 years, you have paraded around this city wearing a crown you did not earn, demanding respect for a throne you did not build. You were the golden child, the flawless, untouchable prodigy. You were the daughter who could do no wrong, while I was the stubborn, difficult disappointment who dared to ask questions. Dominique spat on the ground near my boots, her hands trembling as she tried to push herself up, but her arms gave out and she slumped back against the tire. "You are nothing, Camille. You are just jealous. You have always been jealous of me." I tilted my head, studying her pathetic, broken form. "Jealous?" I repeated, a dry, humorless laugh escaping my lips. Jealous of what, Dominique? Jealous of a parasite? I stepped closer, invading her space, forcing her to look up at me. "Let us talk about your brilliance, Dominique. Let us talk about your extraordinary business acumen that our mother loved to brag about at every country club luncheon and church gala. Do you remember when you started your first luxury event planning company, the one you claimed you built from the ground up with nothing but hustle and vision? You mocked me for taking the city bus to my accounting classes. You laughed at my cheap off-the-rack suits while you wore Chanel and carried Hermes. You told everyone I was wasting my life, grinding in corporate cubicles while you were a natural-born CEO." Dominique squeezed her eyes shut, turning her face away from me. "Stop it," she whimpered, the fight rapidly draining from her voice. "I will not stop," I said, my voice dropping an octave, heavy with a lifetime of suppressed rage. "Because the truth is finally out in the light. You never hustled a day in your life. Your entire existence is a subsidized illusion. Your businesses failed one after another, and every single time Mother and Tyrone quietly siphoned money from my father's logistics company to cover your massive debts. You never met a payroll. You never balanced a ledger. You just played dress-up in executive boardrooms while the adults paid the bills." The first heavy drops of rain began to fall, splattering against the hot asphalt and hissing as they evaporated. "And when my father cut you off, when he finally realized his company was bleeding to death because of your unchecked greed, you did not pull yourself up by your bootstraps." I continued my words, striking her like physical blows. "You and Mother turned to the church. You looked at a building fund meant to house orphans' children with absolutely nothing, and you saw a personal piggy bank. You drove a $200,000 car paid for by the congregation's tithes. You wore diamonds bought with charity money. You are not a Queen Dominique. You are a common thief draped in stolen velvet." The rain began to fall harder, slicking my hair and soaking into the shoulders of my navy blue dress. But I did not move. I stood over her, completely immune to the weather, watching her carefully constructed reality shatter into a million jagged pieces. "You are going to federal prison," I stated calmly. "Marshal Vance has the offshore routing numbers. The IRS has your fraudulent tax returns. The state attorney general is already drafting the indictments for the embezzlement of a registered charity. You are going to lose the cars, the designer bags, the country club memberships, and the respect of every single person in this city. You are going to be stripped down to nothing, and you will finally have to survive on your own merit. And we both know you do not have the spine for it." Dominique stared at me, the rain washing away the last remnants of her smeared makeup. The primal anger that had driven her to attack me was completely gone, extinguished by the terrifying, unavoidable weight of her reality. She was backed into a corner, completely devoid of money allies or legal defense. Violence had failed. Intimidation had failed. The social warfare inside the sanctuary had blown up in her face. She realized in that cold, rain-soaked moment that she was utterly powerless against me. So she pivoted to the only weapon she had left, the ultimate desperate manipulation of a narcissist who has run out of victims. Dominique let out a sudden, agonizing wail. She scrambled forward on the wet asphalt, ignoring the sharp gravel scraping against her bare knees. She threw herself at my feet, wrapping her arms around my calves. I did not try to kick her away. I simply looked down at her, my face a mask of stone. "Camille, please!" Dominique sobbed, her voice cracking as the heavy rain poured down around us, soaking us both to the bone. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and pleading, mastering the performance of a broken, desperate mother. "You cannot do this. You cannot take the money. You cannot send me away." I remained perfectly still, letting her humiliate herself in front of the dozens of church members still watching from the dry safety of the lobby overhang. "Please, Camille," she wailed, her grip tightening on my legs. "Think about what you are doing. If you freeze those accounts, if you take back the estate, you are going to make your own nieces and nephews homeless. We live in the company penthouse. My babies go to private school. They need that money. You cannot punish my children for my mistakes. You are going to put innocent black children out on the street to starve." She pressed her wet face against my knees, her sobs echoing loudly over the sound of the falling rain. Then she tilted her head back, her tear-filled eyes locking onto mine, aiming her final poisoned arrow directly at my deepest, most private pain. "You are only doing this because you are empty inside." Dominique screamed, her voice echoing through the stormy parking lot, loud enough for the entire congregation to hear. "You are destroying my family because you could never have one of your own. You are going to put my children on the street because you are nothing but a bitter, barren spinster." Dominique remained on her knees, the torrential rain flattening her hair and washing streaks of mascara down her pale neck. She kept her hands wrapped tightly around the fabric of my navy blue skirt, using every ounce of her remaining energy to squeeze the last possible drop of emotional leverage from her positioning. The audience on the church steps watched the spectacle in frozen, breathless silence, completely captivated by the final collapse of the city's favorite golden child. Dominique looked up at me through the downpour, her jaw trembling as she waited for the familiar sting of maternal guilt to break my resolve. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked down at her pathetic, dripping form with an expression of pure, unadulterated indifference. I reached down and calmly opened the polished brass latch of my leather briefcase. I did not care that the storm was soaking the interior of the leather, or that the wind was howling across the asphalt. I pulled out a massive, heavily tabbed legal binder encased in waterproof laminate. Without saying a single word, I dropped the thick volume straight down into the muddy puddle of rainwater pooling right at Dominique's bare, gravel-scraped knees. The heavy binder splashed water across her face, forcing her to instinctively release her grip on my skirt and recoil backward. "You have always underestimated my methodology, Dominique," I said, my voice cutting through the steady roar of the rain with a precise, clinical coldness. "You and Mother spent 35 years assuming that because I was quiet, I was compliant. You genuinely believed that I would allow my father's legacy to be dragged into a federal slaughterhouse just because you wrapped your greed in the faces of your children." Dominique frantically wiped the muddy water from her eyes, her hands shaking as she pulled the heavy binder toward her chest. "What is this?" she shrieked, her voice cracking into a desperate whine over the low rumble of thunder. "What else could you possibly take from us? You have already ruined my life." "I did not take anything from them," I replied, staring down at her. "I simply protected them from you. If you bother to open that lamination, you will find the fully executed paperwork for the Sterling Educational Trust." At exactly 9 o'clock on Friday morning, long before you staged that pathetic ambush inside the sanctuary, my legal team finished transferring your children's college funds out of the corporate accounts and into an impenetrable ironclad treasury. Dominique froze her fingers, clawing at the plastic edges of the binder. "What did you do to their money?" "I placed it completely out of your reach," I stated flatly. "The trust is fully funded, fully matured, and entirely secure. My nieces and nephews will have their private school tuitions paid, their healthcare covered, and their university funds completely guaranteed. Their futures are 100% protected." But there is a specific clause in that trust, Dominique, a clause that my father would have mandated himself. Neither you nor Preston can touch a single dime of it. You cannot borrow against it, you cannot use it as collateral for your underground gambling markers, and you cannot use it to pay the lease on a matte black Mercedes G-Wagon. Dominique's face contorted into a mask of pure panic. The realization that she could no longer use her children as a human shield to access the family vault stripped away the last remaining shred of her bravado. She looked like a trapped animal, realizing the exit had been bricked over from the outside. "You are a monster," she whispered, her voice trembling violently as she rocked back on her heels in the rain. "You are doing this to punish me. You want to watch us starve." I ignored her histrionics, reached back into my briefcase, and pulled out a single crisp sheet of heavy parchment paper. The document was neatly stamped with the official seal of the Atlanta Housing Authority and authenticated by the Federal Receivership Board. I stepped forward, bent down, and jammed the paper directly into her wet, trembling hands. "This is your final notification," I said, my tone completely devoid of mercy. "A formal 24-hour eviction notice." Dominique stared at the raised legal lettering, her eyes widening in absolute horror. "The penthouse. Number, no. Camille, you cannot do this. The lease is under the corporate banner. The corporate banner belongs entirely to me now," I replied, standing straight and looking down at her. "You can keep the children's rooms completely intact. I will personally arrange for professional movers to transport their belongings to whatever destination you manage to secure. But as for you and Preston, your authorization expires at exactly 12 o'clock noon tomorrow. You will be stripped of your executive access, your biometric data will be purged from the building's security grid, and you will be physically removed from the property by armed security if you dare to cross the threshold past midday. You wanted to play the role of an independent, brilliant executive, Dominique. Now you get to find your own way." Dominique dropped the legal binder into the mud, her fingers flying to her phone. Her perfect manicured nails were chipped and bleeding from the asphalt as she frantically tapped Preston's speed dial. She shoved the phone against her ear, her whole body shaking violently as she waited for her husband to answer the call, to formulate some kind of survival strategy, to find a loophole that would save them from public ruin. The phone rang once, twice. Then the cold, automated recording of the network provider cut through the sound of the rain. The call went straight to voicemail. "Answer the phone, Preston." Dominique muttered hysterically, her eyes darting around the empty parking lot as she dialed again. "Please answer the phone. Where are you?" I watched her spiral into madness for exactly 3 seconds before a sharp, distinct vibration hummed against my left wrist. I raised my arm, looking down at the screen of my encrypted smartwatch. A real-time alert from the automated security mainframe at the Sterling Logistics headquarters had just populated the display. "Biometric override activated. Deposit box Vault 4. User Preston Vance." A cold, calculating smile spread across my face. I looked away from the watch and focused my gaze back on Dominique, who was still weeping into her silent phone. "He is not going to answer you, Dominique," I said, my voice completely flat. Dominique looked up through the rain, her eyes wide with sudden sickening realization. What? What do you mean? Where is my husband? Preston's biometric pass was just logged at the private deposit vault beneath the downtown branch. I explained, lowering my arm as the rain hammered against the concrete. The exact vault where he has been hiding the cash reserves he siphoned from your church's orphanage fund over the summer. He did not watch the broadcast to help you, Dominique. He watched it to see how much time he had left before the walls closed in. He knew the moment Tyrone was loaded into that federal transport, the game was over. Dominique's phone slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the wet asphalt, the screen cracking instantly as it died. No, she whispered, her lips turning blue from the cold rain. He wouldn't leave me. He wouldn't leave the kids. He is currently clearing out the vault, I said, turning on my heel and walking toward my waiting SUV. He is running, and if you want to catch him before he hits the state line with your children's futures packed into a duffel bag, I suggest you start running too. I did not look back at my sister as I pulled open the heavy armored door of my Cadillac Escalade. The rain was drumming a relentless, deafening beat against the reinforced roof, masking the sound of Dominique's continued sobbing on the wet pavement. Marshall Vance slid into the driver's seat, his soaked suit jacket dripping onto the leather upholstery, while the rest of my private security detail mobilized into the trailing vehicles. I settled into the back seat, wiping a stray drop of rain from my cheek with absolute composure. I pulled my encrypted tablet from my damp briefcase and immediately opened a secure audio channel to my forensic accounting team in New York. The screen flashed green, and the sharp clinical voice of Marcus, my lead forensic auditor, filled the quiet cabin of the SUV. "We have a massive problem, Ms. Sterling," Marcus announced, skipping pleasantries entirely. "Preston just breached Vault 4. I replied, my voice steady. "I received the biometric alert on my watch. Tell me what he took." "Everything," Marcus stated flatly. "We locked down every single digital account tied to his name, Vivian's name, and the church shell corporations within 30 seconds of your presentation inside the sanctuary. But Preston is not operating digitally anymore. He bypassed the network completely. I instructed Vance to pull out of the Greater Zion Cathedral parking lot. We left my mother and sister dealing with the absolute wreckage of their public lives, the angry mob of churchgoers still swarming the portico." "Explain his bypass," I ordered Marcus, pulling up the vault schematics on my tablet screen. "When the footage of your church presentation hit social media, it went viral instantly." Marcus explained, the rapid clacking of his keyboard filtering over the audio feed. "Someone live streamed the entire thing from the balcony. Preston was monitoring the feed. The second he saw the orphanage bank statements projected on those screens, he knew the federal indictments were coming. He initiated a total burn protocol. He accessed a physical safety deposit box that was entirely off the books." "What was inside?" I demanded. "Untraceable physical bearer bonds," Marcus said, "and a substantial cache of blood diamonds. We are looking at roughly $8 million in highly portable, highly liquid physical assets. Assets he can trade anywhere in the world without triggering a single banking alert." I gripped the edge of my tablet. Preston was a coward, but a highly calculating coward. He had known this day might come, and he had built an emergency parachute funded entirely by my father's stolen legacy and the congregation's pilfered tithes. "Where is he going?" I asked, looking up at the rearview mirror to meet Vance's eyes. "We tracked his burner phone pinging off a cell tower 20 miles north of the city," Marcus replied. "He bypassed the major commercial hubs. He is heading straight for Blackwood Aviation, a secluded, privately owned airstrip. He chartered a Gulfstream G650 using a fake corporate shell. Flight plan is filed for an immediate departure to a non-extradition territory." I relayed the destination to Vance. He did not hesitate. He slammed his foot on the accelerator, and the heavy SUV surged forward, the tires fighting for traction on the slick, rain-washed pavement. The trailing security vehicles matched our sudden aggressive acceleration, forming a tight, impenetrable convoy as we merged onto the crowded Atlanta interstate. The summer thunderstorm had plunged the city into premature darkness. Lightning spiderwebbed across the black sky, illuminating the heavy sheets of rain that lashed against our windshield. Atlanta traffic is notoriously unforgiving on a clear, sunny afternoon, But during a torrential downpour, the highway was a treacherous landscape of glowing brake lights and hydroplaning vehicles. "We do not have time for this traffic," I stated, bracing myself against the leather armrest as Vance swerved violently to avoid a stalled sedan. Vance reached forward and engaged the emergency strobes concealed in the grille of our SUV. The blinding alternating flashes of blue and white light parted the sea of crawling cars like a scythe. We accelerated into the emergency lane, the heavy engine roaring as we pushed past 80 miles per hour through the blinding storm. "Marcus, status update," I commanded into the tablet. "The Gulfstream is on the tarmac," Marcus reported, his voice tight with tension. "They are running pre-flight checks right now. We are monitoring their air traffic control clearance telemetry in real time. The pilots just requested priority clearance for an emergency medical transport to bypass the weather delay." Preston was exploiting a medical emergency loophole to get his stolen fortune out of United States airspace. The audacity of the man was truly staggering. He was abandoning his wife and children to face federal prosecutors while he escaped to a tropical paradise with $8 million in stolen diamonds. "How much time until wheels up?" I asked, my eyes fixed on the rain-lashed road ahead. 12 minutes, Marcus replied. "The tower just granted preliminary clearance. The pilots are spooling the engines. You have to intercept him before that plane hits the runway. Once he is airborne, international jurisdictional red tape will tie us up for years." "Understood. Keep the channel open." I looked out the window at the blurred passing trees. My father had spent his entire life building sterling logistics with his bare hands. He had sacrificed his health, his time, and his peace of mind to create a legacy of generational wealth. I was not going to let a mediocre, gambling-addicted parasite stuff that legacy into a duffel bag and fly away. "Vance, we have 10 minutes, I said quietly. Vance did not reply verbally. He simply pressed the accelerator closer to the floorboard. The SUV hydroplaned across a massive puddle, the anti-lock brakes engaging with a violent shudder, but Vance maintained absolute control. We exited the interstate, tearing down a winding 2-lane rural road flanked by dense Georgia pines. The trees formed a dark, suffocating tunnel, their heavy branches swaying aggressively in the storm winds. 3 miles out, Vance announced, his eyes narrowed as he navigated a sharp, blind curve. "They are disconnecting from the ground power unit," Marcus updated through the tablet speakers. "The Gulfstream is officially running on internal power. They are preparing to taxi." The pressure inside the cabin was immense. Every second that ticked by felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. I could picture Preston sitting in the plush leather seat of the private jet, clutching his briefcase of stolen diamonds, nervously watching the rain streak across the porthole window, believing he had outsmarted us all. He thought he could exploit my mother's greed, ruin my sister's life, and walk away entirely untouched. He was vastly mistaken. The trees suddenly broke, revealing the flat, expansive clearing of the Blackwood Aviation Airstrip. The perimeter was secured by a 10-foot-high chain-link fence topped with razor wire. At the entrance, a heavy reinforced steel gate blocked the access road, flanked by a small illuminated security guard booth. "Gate is locked," Vance stated, his hands gripping the steering wheel tight enough to turn his knuckles white. "Do not stop," I ordered, my voice absolutely devoid of hesitation. Vance braced himself against the seat back. The massive Cadillac Escalade did not decelerate. We hit the reinforced steel gate at 60 miles per hour. The sound of the impact was explosive, a deafening screech of tearing metal and shattering fiberglass. The heavy steel doors buckled inward, groaning under the sheer kinetic force of the armored SUV, before snapping off their hinges entirely. We burst through the barricade in a shower of sparks and twisted metal, our trailing security vehicles roaring through the breach immediately behind us. We fishtailed onto the wet, slick tarmac, the headlights of our convoy cutting through the torrential rain and the darkness of the airfield. There, positioned at the far end of the runway, was the sleek white chassis of the Gulfstream G650. The aircraft's navigation strobes were flashing brightly against the storm. A deafening high-pitched whine ripped through the air, vibrating right through the reinforced glass of my vehicle. The jet's massive twin engines had just fired up, blasting a violent stream of hot exhaust and rainwater across the tarmac. Preston was inside, and he was seconds away from rolling down the runway. The roar of the Gulfstream's twin Rolls-Royce engines was absolutely deafening. shaking the wet asphalt beneath our tires as the massive aircraft began its forward roll. The pilots were clearly rushing the pre-flight protocols, prioritizing a desperate escape over standard aviation safety. The nose of the jet turned, aligning precisely with the center stripe of the rain-slicked runway. "Hit it, Vance!" I commanded, my voice perfectly steady, despite the adrenaline surging through the cabin. Vance did not hesitate. He slammed the accelerator to the floorboard. The heavily armored Cadillac Escalade surged forward, its massive V8 engine roaring in defiance of the storm. We shot across the tarmac, cutting a direct diagonal path toward the accelerating aircraft. We were playing a high-stakes game of chicken with a 65,000-pound jet, and I had absolutely no intention of blinking. The jet's landing lights glared through our windshield, blindingly bright in the torrential downpour. We crossed the threshold of the runway just as the Gulf Stream reached 50 knots. Vance whipped the steering wheel hard to the left, positioning the broad, reinforced steel side of our SUV directly in the path of the aircraft's front landing gear. The pilots realized they were trapped. A collision at this speed would completely shear off their landing gear, igniting the thousands of gallons of aviation fuel stored in the wings. Through the deafening noise of the storm, I heard the violent screeching wail of the jet's thrust reversers deploying. The massive aircraft shuddered violently, its tires locking up and skidding across the wet tarmac in a thick cloud of burning rubber and white smoke. The Gulfstream came to a shuddering, violent halt less than 20 feet from the passenger side door of my Escalade. Instantly, the rest of my security convoy swarmed the runway. 4 black SUVs boxed the aircraft in from all sides, effectively pinning the jet in a cage of reinforced steel. The high beams of our vehicles illuminated the sleek white fuselage, trapping it in a harsh, inescapable crossfire of light. The jet's engines powered down to a low, defeated whine. I sat comfortably in the front passenger seat, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored blazer. I waited. A heavy silence fell over the airstrip, broken only by the steady, rhythmic drumming of the rain against the roof of the SUV. 30 seconds later, the hydraulic seal of the Gulfstream's main cabin door hissed, and the motorized staircase deployed, lowering slowly to the wet tarmac. Preston stepped out into the storm. He was completely unrecognizable from the arrogant, perfectly manicured country club socialite he pretended to be. He wore a rumpled gray tracksuit, his hair plastered to his forehead by the driving rain. He was clutching 2 heavy black canvas duffel bags to his chest, as if his life depended on them. When he looked out at the perimeter of armed security contractors surrounding his escape vessel, his face drained of all color, he looked exactly like what he was, a cornered, terrified rat. He slowly descended the stairs, his expensive loafers splashing into the deep puddles pooling on the runway. He walked directly toward my Escalade, his eyes darting frantically past the glare of the headlights. Vance reached forward and lowered my passenger window just a few inches, allowing the cold, damp air to fill the cabin. I did not lean out. I stayed perfectly composed in the dry, leather-lined interior, watching Preston shiver in the storm. "Camille, please!" Preston shouted over the rain, his voice cracking with sheer panic. He stepped closer to the window, hoisting one of the heavy duffel bags up to his chest. "Listen to me. You are a businesswoman. You understand leverage. We can make a deal right here, right now." I rested my elbow on the armrest, my face an unreadable mask of absolute stone. I did not speak. I simply let him dig his own grave. "I have $8 million right here." Preston stammered frantically, unzipping the top of the canvas bag. He thrust it toward the window crack. Inside, thick stacks of untraceable bearer bonds were packed tightly alongside several black velvet pouches. I liquidated everything. Blood diamonds, offshore bonds, completely untraceable physical assets. It is totally off the books, Camille. The feds do not even know it exists. He wiped the rain from his eyes, his breathing ragged and desperate. "I will give you half," Preston pleaded, his voice reaching a pathetic, high-pitched whine. $4 million, completely untaxed, clean and clear. You can take the bag right now. Just tell your men to move the vehicles. Let the pilots taxi. Let me fly out of this country and you will never see or hear from me again. You get your revenge, you get your money, and I disappear. Everybody wins. I stared at him, my expression radiating nothing but clinical disgust. You think you can buy your way out of a federal embezzlement indictment with the money you stole from my father's company? I asked softly. Preston shook his head violently, water flying from his hair. It was not me, he screamed, his self-preservation instinct completely overriding any shred of loyalty he possessed. Camille, you have to believe me. I did not orchestrate this. I am just the bagman. It was Vivian. It was your mother. She came to me when your father's health started declining. She said she needed a shadow account to protect her lifestyle in case he left everything to you. She forced me to set up the Cayman Shell corporations. I remained utterly silent, allowing his cowardice to consume him. And Dominique was in on it the whole time, Preston yelled, throwing his own wife directly under the speeding bus. Do not look at me like I am the mastermind, Camille. Dominique is a greedy, incompetent pawn. She spent the orphanage money as fast as I could launder it. She knew exactly where the cash was coming from to pay for her cars and her penthouses. I was just trying to secure a future for myself, because those women are completely insane. Preston stepped closer, leaning his wet face near the glass. He lowered his voice into a conspiratorial, desperate whisper. I can prove it, Camille. I can be your star witness. I have audio files. I have the original wire transfer authorizations with Vivian's signature. I will give you everything you need to lock your mother and your sister in a federal penitentiary for the next 30 years. Just let me get on that plane. You would testify against the mother of your children, I asked, my tone completely flat. They are monsters, Camille Preston fired back without a single second of hesitation. You do not know what they are capable of. You think the embezzlement is the worst of it. He let out a dark, frantic laugh. They killed your father. The air inside the Escalade turned to absolute ice. My grip on the door handle tightened, my knuckles turning white, but my face remained perfectly impassive. Explain that, I commanded. Jeremiah was not dying fast enough for them. Preston confessed, the words spilling out of his mouth in a torrential flood of guilt and betrayal. His heart condition was stabilizing. The doctors said he could live for another decade. Vivian and Dominique could not wait that long. They wanted the estate before he had a chance to finalize the succession plan with you. Dominique got a corrupt pharmacist on our payroll. They swapped his prescribed blood pressure medication with high-grade lethal stimulants. They triggered the aneurysm, Camille. They murdered him. I have the receipts from the pharmacy. I will give them to you. Just let me go. He stood there in the pouring rain, clutching his bag of stolen diamonds, completely convinced he had just negotiated his freedom by confessing to his complicity in my father's murder. He thought he was brilliant. He thought I was alone in the car. He was incredibly wrong. I did not wear a wire. I did not need to coordinate a hidden recording device. I simply reached my hand toward the master control panel on the driver's side armrest. I looked Preston directly in his desperate, pathetic eyes, and I pressed a single silver button. With a low mechanical hum, the heavily tinted, bulletproof rear window of my Escalade slid slowly down. Dominique was sitting in the back seat. When I had turned my back on her in the cathedral parking lot, she had scrambled into the rear cabin of my SUV in a blind, pathetic panic, demanding a ride to find her husband so they could formulate a survival plan. I had silently allowed her to stay, knowing exactly what purpose she would serve. She had been sitting in the dark just inches away from the glass. She had heard every single word. Preston froze. The color drained from his face so rapidly he looked like a corpse. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The duffel bag of diamonds slipped from his fingers, landing with a heavy, muted splash in a puddle on the tarmac. Dominique's face was a masterpiece of absolute catastrophic horror. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, locked onto the man she had married. She had just listened to her husband call her a greedy, incompetent pawn. She had just listened to him eagerly offer to testify against her. She had just listened to him confess to the federal authorities that she had murdered her own father. Preston, Dominique whispered, her voice a hollow, shattered rasp that barely carried over the sound of the rain. "Dominique, baby, no!" Preston stammered, taking a clumsy step backward. I was just telling her what she wanted to hear. I was trying to buy us time. You traded me. Dominique screamed, the sound tearing out of her throat, with such raw, visceral agony that it echoed across the entire airfield. You coward! You pathetic, weak, traitorous coward. You were going to leave me to take the fall for my father's murder while you ran away with the money." She lunged toward the open window, her hands clawing wildly at the empty air between them, screaming profanities that were completely lost to the howling wind. The final toxic pillar of her glamorous life, her perfect marriage, completely imploded right there on the wet asphalt, incinerated by Preston's cowardice. Before Preston could attempt another pathetic excuse, a blinding array of red and blue emergency lights pierced through the darkness at the far end of the runway. The wail of federal sirens cut through the thunderstorm. A convoy of 6 black armored transport vans and marked police cruisers tore through the shattered gates of the aviation center, speeding directly down the tarmac toward our position. I had never intended to let Preston negotiate. The moment Marcus had intercepted the flight telemetry from the Gulfstream, I had forwarded the exact GPS coordinates and the offshore banking data directly to my contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They had been waiting for my signal. Preston whipped his head around, staring at the approaching fleet of federal vehicles. He looked back at me, his eyes wide with betrayal. "You tipped them off," he gasped. "I do not negotiate with the people who murdered my father," I replied, my voice as cold and unforgiving as a steel blade. The federal convoy skidded to a halt, boxing in the jet and the security vehicles. Dozens of heavily armed FBI agents and federal marshals swarmed the tarmac, their tactical flashlights cutting through the rain. "Preston Vance," a voice boomed over a megaphone. "Keep your hands where we can see them and get down on the ground." Preston did not run. He did not fight. He simply dropped to his knees in the puddles, interlacing his fingers behind his head as the federal agents descended upon him. They slammed him face down onto the rough asphalt, roughly wrenching his arms behind his back. The distinct metallic click of heavy handcuffs echoed through the storm. As they hauled him to his feet, an agent began reading him his rights, shouting the charges over the rain. Wire fraud, embezzlement of a charitable organization, flight to avoid prosecution, conspiracy to commit murder. I sat in the dry, quiet comfort of my luxury SUV and watched them drag Preston away, his stolen duffel bags seized as federal evidence. In the back seat, Dominique was trembling violently. Her expensive clothes were soaked, her makeup completely ruined, her entire reality entirely dismantled. She had no husband. She had no money. She was facing a life sentence in a federal penitentiary for the murder of my father, and her mother would undoubtedly betray her to save herself. She turned her head slowly, her shattered, terrified eyes meeting mine in the rearview mirror. She was completely alone, stripped of every defense, every lie, and every piece of unearned armor she had ever worn. I looked back at her. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I did not smile. I simply reached down to the master control panel, pressed the silver button, and rolled the tinted window back up, sealing her inside her own personal hell. The tinted glass sealed shut with a soft mechanical thud, cutting off the frantic, pathetic screaming of my sister and the wailing sirens of the approaching federal agents. I did not look back. I simply instructed Marshal Vance to drive, leaving the wreckage of my family completely behind me on that rain-slicked tarmac. Over the next 6 months, the relentless, suffocating heat of the Atlanta summer surrendered to a crisp, biting winter. The absolute chaos that had erupted during my hostile takeover solidified into a cold, permanent reality. The federal indictments fell like heavy iron dominoes, swift and utterly devastating, completely dismantling the fraudulent empire my mother had built over my father's grave. I sat in the plush leather seat of my chauffeured vehicle on a bright, cloudless Tuesday morning, sipping a black coffee, while the financial news broadcast played over the audio system. The anchor's voice was crisp and clinical, delivering the final verdict on a scandal that had captivated the city's elite for half a year. I listened intently as the reporter detailed the sentencing of Preston Vance and my uncle Tyrone Sterling. The federal judge had shown absolutely zero leniency during the proceedings, stating on the record that their actions were a masterclass in parasitic greed. Both men were convicted of a staggering list of charges, including wire fraud, grand larceny, tax evasion, and the embezzlement of a registered charitable organization. The courtroom sketches broadcasted over the last few weeks depicted Tyrone weeping openly at the defense table, his arrogant bravado entirely erased by the terrifying reality of his actions. Preston had attempted to leverage his earlier confession for a plea deal, begging the prosecution for mercy, but the sheer volume of his financial crimes negated any possibility of grace. They were each handed maximum sentences of 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The anchor made a point to emphasize the specific mandate attached to their sentences by the prosecution. There would be no possibility of early parole, no reduced time for good behavior. They were locked in concrete and steel-stripped of their tailored suits and offshore accounts, facing 2 full decades of brutal, inescapable isolation. I took a slow, measured sip of my coffee, feeling a profound, quiet satisfaction settle deep in my chest. The cancer had been entirely excised from the Sterling legacy. While Preston and Tyrone traded their luxury lives for federal jumpsuits, the women who had orchestrated the entire scheme faced a prison of a completely different nature. My mother, Vivian, had fallen from the absolute pinnacle of Atlanta high society down to the jagged, unforgiving bottom. Stripped of the Sterling estate, her platinum corporate credit cards, and her hidden offshore accounts, she had been forced into immediate bankruptcy. She now resided in a cramped, deeply unfashionable 2-bedroom apartment in a deteriorating complex on the industrial outskirts of the city. The sprawling mahogany staircases, vaulted ceilings, and crystal chandeliers she once commanded were replaced by peeling linoleum floors, low popcorn ceilings, stained with water damage, and the constant muffled sounds of neighbors arguing through paper-thin walls. But the loss of square footage and financial power was not her true punishment. Her ultimate suffocating torture was her complete and total social exile. The very moment the news of the orphanage embezzlement scandal broke, the elite circles she had ruthlessly controlled turned their backs on her with terrifying synchronized speed. She was completely excommunicated from Greater Zion Cathedral. Pastor Jenkins, desperate to save his own lucrative ministry from the fallout of the federal investigation, had publicly denounced her from the very pulpit where she once reigned as the untouchable matriarch. She had attempted to reach out to her former country club allies, begging for loans or temporary housing, only to be met with disconnected numbers or outright laughter before the line went dead. Her phone never rang. The women who used to beg for an invitation to her afternoon tea parties now crossed the street to avoid her, treating her name like a toxic, highly contagious disease. She spent her days entirely alone in her claustrophobic apartment, sitting in a cheap, faded armchair, watching daytime television, completely paralyzed by her irrelevance. She had no power, no audience, no bankroll, and no one left to manipulate. My sister Dominique faced an equally brutal, uncompromising awakening. The golden child who had spent 35 years believing she was too inherently brilliant for actual labor was finally introduced to the crushing reality of the working class. With her bank accounts frozen by the federal government, her luxury vehicles repossessed by the dealerships, and her husband sitting in a federal cell, she had no choice but to find immediate employment to survive. She was currently working a grueling 10-hour shift as a retail manager at a mid-tier discount department store in a dying suburban mall. The woman who used to carry $50,000 Hermes bags and mock my corporate work ethic was now forced to wear a cheap, itchy polyester uniform and a plastic name tag bearing her first name. Her days consisted of unloading heavy cardboard shipment boxes in a dusty stockroom, folding endless messy stacks of discounted sweaters, and enduring the brutal, demeaning demands of impatient, angry shoppers. Just last week, one of her former high society brunch companions had walked into the store to make a return. Dominique was forced to personally process the transaction at the register, staring at the floor in absolute humiliation, while her former friend looked at her with a mixture of shock and poorly concealed amusement. She stood on her feet all day under harsh headache-inducing fluorescent lights, her calves aching and her spine throbbing. Her perfectly manicured hands, once soft and adorned with diamonds, were now dry, cracked, and calloused from manual labor. I had kept my promise regarding her children. I refused to let my nieces and nephews suffer for the sins of their parents. The Sterling Educational Trust I had established was fully funded and completely operational, but it was designed with absolute impenetrable hostility toward Dominique. She received a strict, heavily monitored weekly allowance from the trust distributed through a restricted, prepaid card system. Every single transaction was tracked and audited by an independent financial firm based in New York. The funds could only be used at approved grocery stores, pediatric pharmacies, and the leasing office for her modest, low-income townhouse. If she attempted to buy a bottle of wine, a designer lipstick, or withdraw a single dollar in cash, the transaction was automatically declined at the register, and the account was instantly frozen, pending an audit. She was forced to swallow her pride every single time she swiped that card, standing at the checkout line and praying the transaction would clear, knowing that her entire survival was completely dictated by my terms. She had to wake up every morning before dawn, take a crowded public commuter bus to her retail job, and earn her minimum wage paycheck just to afford her own personal expenses. Dominique was learning the brutal, inescapable value of $1 agonizing shift at a time. I turned my attention away from the morning news broadcast as my driver smoothly merged onto the downtown exit, navigating the familiar bustling streets of the financial district. The rain and darkness of the past 6 months were entirely gone, replaced by a brilliant, blindingly clear morning. The heavy SUV pulled up to the polished curb, and my private security detail immediately stepped out, opening the reinforced door for me. I stepped out onto the pristine pavement, smoothing the lapels of my tailored, immaculate white blazer. I took a deep, refreshing breath of the city air, tilting my head back to look up at the magnificent structure standing before me. The newly renovated towering glass headquarters of Sterling Logistics gleamed brightly against the skyline, a flawless monument to hard work, unyielding integrity, and absolute victory. I walked through the revolving glass doors of the main lobby, the pristine marble floors clicking firmly beneath my heels. The atmosphere inside the building had been entirely transformed over the past 6 months. Gone was the suffocating tension, the toxic whispers of impending bankruptcy, and the paranoid, incompetent micromanagement that Preston had infected this space with during his brief, disastrous tenure as acting director. Instead, there was a vibrant, undeniable hum of genuine productivity. The air smelled of fresh coffee and quiet, focused ambition. The massive digital tracking boards that monitored our global shipping fleets glowed brightly on the lobby walls, showing optimal efficiency across every single operational sector. I exchanged warm morning greetings with the security personnel and the front desk staff as I crossed the expansive atrium. These were the people my father had originally hired, the loyal, hardworking men and women whose pensions, mortgages, and livelihoods had been directly threatened by my mother's insatiable greed. I knew their names, I knew their families, and I knew exactly how close they had come to losing everything they had worked for. I had not only protected their jobs, but I had fundamentally secured their futures. Over the past 2 quarters, we had initiated a massive, aggressive expansion protocol. We had hired 300 new employees right here in the local community, breathing new, revitalized life into the city's shipping infrastructure. We had upgraded our transport fleet, modernized our sorting facilities with state-of-the-art technology, and instituted a comprehensive profit-sharing program for the warehouse floor workers. I stepped into the private executive elevator and swiped my encrypted biometric keycard. The heavy steel doors closed, seamlessly isolating me in a quiet chamber as the car carried me up to the top floor of the tower. The penthouse executive suite had been entirely stripped of the gaudy, ostentatious decor my mother and Dominique had briefly attempted to install during their attempted corporate coup. I had personally ordered the immediate removal of the ridiculous gold leaf accents, the oversized velvet seating, and the overpriced, tasteless modern art they had purchased with stolen company funds. I had restored the space to reflect my father's original pragmatic vision, blending classic dark mahogany with modern, streamlined efficiency. The office commanded respect without ever needing to beg for it. The panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed, breathtaking view of the Atlanta skyline. It was a sprawling kingdom of commerce, transport, and logistics that now operated firmly and undisputed under my command. I walked over to the massive executive desk, running my hand along the polished wood before setting my leather briefcase down. The latest quarterly financial reports were already neatly stacked on my blotter, courtesy of Marcus and his brilliant, unrelenting forensic accounting division. I did not even need to open the manila folders to know the exact numbers printed inside. I already knew them by heart. Sterling Logistics had not merely survived the embezzlement scandal and the resulting public relations nightmare. We had thrived aggressively in its wake. When the industry competitors smelled blood in the water, 6 months ago they had circled like sharks, attempting a hostile buyout of our major distribution routes. I had systematically crushed every single one of their bids. Under my strict, uncompromising corporate restructuring, our profit margins had shattered every previous company record. We had successfully secured 3 major federal shipping contracts that Preston had completely bungled through his sheer incompetence, and our overall corporate valuation had entirely doubled. The Sterling name was no longer associated with scandal-whispered gossip or federal indictments. It was once again a towering, unshakable symbol of industry dominance. I walked around the edge of the desk and picked up a heavy silver-framed photograph resting near my computer monitor. It was a picture of me and my father taken 5 years ago during a corporate retreat in the mountains. He was smiling warmly, his eyes crinkling at the corners, his arm wrapped proudly and securely around my shoulders. I traced the cool edge of the metal frame, feeling a profound settling peace wash over me. The sharp, agonizing grief of his sudden death had finally softened into a quiet, enduring strength. For so long, I had believed that saving this company was strictly about protecting a balance sheet and preserving a financial legacy. But looking at his face in the bright morning light, I understood the absolute, unvarnished truth. I had not just saved a corporation, I had performed a necessary, brutal, and life-saving surgery. I had entirely excised the terminal rot that was silently killing our family from the inside out. My mother and my sister had poisoned his life with their boundless entitlement, their vanity, and their relentless demands for more. And they had ultimately stopped his heart with their terrifying greed. They had expected me to fold under the pressure. They had expected me to cry in a corner, to quietly accept my assigned role as the subservient, invisible daughter, while they danced on his grave and liquidated his fortune. They had used the concept of family loyalty as a weapon to demand my silent compliance. Instead, I had become their absolute, inescapable reckoning. I set the photograph back down on the desk and opened the top right drawer. I reached inside and pulled out a single crumpled $100 bill. It was the exact same bill Preston had arrogantly thrown at my feet months ago in the church hallway. I remembered that day with crystal clarity. I remembered the smug, condescending sneer on his face as he tossed the money onto the carpet, mocking my plain clothes, mocking my silence, mocking my methodical nature. He had told me to buy myself a personality, genuinely believing he held all the cards. He had thought his tailored suits his stolen millions, and his loud bravado made him completely untouchable. I carried the crumpled currency over to a custom-built illuminated glass display case resting on the corner of my mahogany credenza. I unlocked the heavy glass lid, carefully smoothed out the wrinkled green paper, and pinned it securely to the black velvet backing. I closed the case, locking the brass latch with a sharp, satisfying click. It was not just a piece of paper. It was a permanent daily reminder of my absolute victory. It was a physical trophy of the exact moment my enemies had finalized their own destruction by fundamentally underestimating my intelligence. They had mistaken my observation for ignorance. They had mistaken my patience for fear. They had looked at my quiet dedication and confused it for weakness. I took my seat in the heavy leather executive chair, feeling the solid, undeniable weight of my position. I turned my back to the panoramic window, letting the morning sun cast a warm golden glow across the CEO office. I looked straight ahead, completely grounded in my power, completely secure in my legacy, and I spoke directly to you. The ultimate lesson from Camille's story is that true power does not roar. It observes, calculates, and strikes with precision. When faced with toxic family members who manipulate, belittle, and exploit you, the most effective response is never emotional retaliation. It is silent, unstoppable elevation. Toxic people thrive on your reactions and depend on your subjugation. By secretly building your own empire, securing your assets, and refusing to play their rigged games, you strip them of their leverage. Real justice is reclaiming your independence and allowing their own arrogance and greed to orchestrate their absolute downfall while you completely ascend. Share your own story of breaking free from toxic environments in the comments below, and subscribe for more empowering content.